Hello, my name is Mindy Belz. I'm senior editor at World Magazine and a longtime reporter covering conflicts in the Middle East and Africa. It's my pleasure and privilege today to welcome to this panel the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. The High Commissioner came into his position in 2016 at the height of the world's worst refugee crisis in modern times, with at least 60 million people who forcibly displaced from their homes. He has been a tireless advocate for their welfare, and in his work as an Italian diplomat and a UN official, has taken posts in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Commissioner Grandi has headed emergency operations in nearly every conflict you can name, from Sudan to Yemen to Afghanistan. Welcome, High Commissioner. It's a privilege to be speaking with you today.
Thank you very much, Mindy, and thanks for having me. I'm very grateful.
I want us to turn our attention first to the growing flow of migrants in the Western Hemisphere and at the borders of Latin American countries in the United States. Over the past decade, as you know, rampant poverty and homicide rates, escalating natural disasters, all these things in the Caribbean and Northern Triangle have generated unprecedented internal displacement. Many of those populations showing up en masse at borders in Central America and at the borders of my own country in the United States, at our southern border. There seems to be, at the same time, with these increased populations, a correlating increase in nativism and fear, and even open animosity toward these migrants. Public opinion and American politics, I can say, have dominated the discourse on these issues. But what are the legal implications for the United States under international and domestic law towards these migrants?
I think you're quite right. After speaking about the global displacement crisis, to zoom in one of its most large and complex examples, which is the crisis in and around Central America. We estimate that if you take the 3 countries of the northern part of Central America alone, Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador, there's about 1 million people, 3 small countries, about 1 million people that are either displaced within those countries or have tried to flee abroad and seek asylum abroad. We have just a little bit further south, Nicaragua, which is undergoing a very complicated political crisis, and people from Nicaragua are also adding themselves to the rest of the displacement. And when you look at the root causes, because to answer your question, it's important to look at why people are moving. You have a phenomenal complexity of causes. Some are economic, some are social, many are linked to criminality, but violence, because of that, is a very primary driver of displacement and flight. So we say in UNHCR that the people we care for are the people who need protection, especially international protection. And many of these people qualify to be people of relevance, of concern to UNHCR. Of course, we should dispel, and then I'll answer your question, we should dispel the notion that everybody is moving north to the US, although that's a very important axis of movement, because increasingly we see people seeking asylum and protection in Mexico, for example. People from Nicaragua flee essentially southwards to Costa Rica. And like I said, there's a lot of internal displacement. So it's a very complex situation, reflecting what we see in many other parts of the world. Now, coming to the United States, because some people are getting there, and no matter how much we reinforce the structures of other people to deal, of other countries, to deal with these flows, inevitably a large number will continue to attempt to cross into the United States. Here, in fully recognizing the complexity of this issue, we need to say one fundamental thing. The United States has signed the 1967 protocol of the 1951 Refugee Convention, and one of the tenets of this important legal instrument is that nobody seeking asylum should be sent back to his or her country without due process of verification if his or her claim is legitimate. Because this would expose this person, sending back these people, exposes them, I should say, to dangers, very big dangers, being killed, being imprisoned, being further displaced, undergoing violence, and so forth. And the Refugee Act of the United States, the 1980 Refugee Act, stipulates that very clearly. Now, that's why we're saying to the United States, give people access to process. Doesn't mean that everybody will become a refugee and will get asylum, but give them access to process. Unfortunately, the escalation of this movement and the slow pace of reform of what we call the asylum system in the immigration system in the United States has caused a gigantic backlog that makes now that access to due process more and more complicated. When President Biden took office less than a year ago, he said that one of his objectives was to give back to the United States an immigration policy that would be both humane and effective. Now, the two things are inextricably linked. If it is effective, it will be easier to have it as a humane immigration policy. So we've said many times to the US, let's work together. We can also support you in making all the necessary reforms to avoid this policy becoming inhumane. Unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of people have been deported without due process, and this continues to happen. So it is urgent to go about those reforms that the administration has declared it wants to do.
And digging into that just a little bit, in a recent statement, you said that the summary mass expulsions of migrants from the United States under Title 42, the health rule, that means they're denied process, what you call access to process, without their being screened for protection needs. Would you call those inconsistent with international norms? What are the implications of that?
Look, COVID-19 was such a, what can I say, such an incredible disruption in every aspect of everybody's life that, of course, when it burst, and you remember how quickly it happened and it spread, states became very worried. And, it is the responsibility of states, including the United States, to protect their population from the virus. And therefore, it was understandable that at least in the initial phase of the pandemic, very tight rules at borders in terms of access of people through borders would apply indiscriminately to everybody, including to people for whom movement was life-saving because they were escaping from violence or conflict. But with the passage of time, we have seen, including in countries with far less resources than the United States. Think of Uganda. I often give this example because it was very remarkable. Uganda allowed people fleeing from conflict in nearby Congo and then ask us to help them manage it in pandemic's time. So we helped them with testing, for example, the new arrivals. We helped them with organizing isolation areas or quarantine processes. We helped with beefing up health screening. Now, these measures proved effective. And but more importantly, from my point of view, proved that you can both protect populations from the virus and protect asylum seekers from the risks they're fleeing from without obliging them to go back to conflict, to violence, and so forth. That's why after the initial phase, we told the United States, we understood why this Title 42, which invokes health reasons to limit access to asylum, we understand why it was established, but the time has come to lift that restriction and to adopt measures that other countries have also adopted to manage asylum requests without deporting people indiscriminately because of health risks.
And would you envision something of an international response at, say, the U.S.-Texas border to do that? Or do you think it's something that the United States should be mounting on its own?
No country, not even the United States for its own wealth and might, can deal with these issues alone. That's what we have learned in Europe, for example, in 2000. You mentioned when I became head of UNHCR, High Commissioner, was in the middle of this huge flow of people into Europe. And, many of the failures that we observed them were because of lack of cooperation. We keep seeing those failures in Europe today in addressing migratory and refugee flows. So it has to be collective. And of course, the United States have a huge responsibility. Reforming the asylum system and managing border flows is their responsibility. But the overall phenomenon of displacement in Central America, Mexico, and beyond is something that needs to be addressed by the states in the region. By the way, UNHCR launched an initiative with states in the region. We call it MIRPS. It's a Spanish acronym. It's a framework for protection and solutions. And it's not big, but it is an attempt to look at some of the things that can be done together by states in the region with the support of donors, including the US, Canada, and others, to mitigate the effects and start working on the root causes of this movement, which is really, in the end, what will pay off. This is really what will eventually reduce the necessity of these flows. But that's long-term work. There are some short-term measures that this framework foresees and which states in the region really own very strongly, for which we need support and which could begin turning the tide.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I want to turn our attention to some other spots in the world that also are contributing to the ongoing refugee crisis that we see. Let's talk about the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban and the withdrawal of Western troops that's happened in August and left thousands of Afghans fearing for their lives, essentially. What do you think should be the response of Europe and the United States at this point toward Afghan evacuees? You and I both are aware of these massive efforts that are very kind of extra government efforts to evacuate Afghans even as we speak. But what should governments be doing and learning from what's happening in Afghanistan?
I hope I don't sound provocative here, but I think the focus has now to shift away from evacuations and on what needs to be done inside Afghanistan to avoid having more and more people that are in need of protection, are, as you put it, at risk. I know it may sound paradoxical because the perception that the world and perhaps even especially in the United States people have of the Taliban is of an intractable group of people with whom you can't discuss, and therefore let's try to extract as many people as possible from the country that could be exposed to their retaliation, to their policies, and so forth. I think the reality, unfortunately, is not like that, not least because evacuations were possible in that initial phase, and it was good that many countries evacuated people that had been associated with their embassies, with their military, and so forth, and the NGOs did the same. But, there's very limited space to do it now, that the Taliban are in power. So I think that what needs to be done in priority, whilst these efforts on a much smaller scale continue, what needs to be done now is to really work inside Afghanistan to try and mitigate the worst consequences of what has happened. I think it's possible. I was in Afghanistan in early September, 3 weeks after the takeover of the Taliban. And, dialogue with them will not be easy. That's very clear. But it is important to engage. There's no plan B there. Nobody's going to have another war to try to dislodge the Taliban and put back the old government. Sorry to say, that's the reality now. So we have to work with them and working with them means, one, really stepping up as we are doing a massive humanitarian operation, because for many people, the need, is not even the fundamental rights, is eating tonight or putting a roof on the head of their children, or basic medications for diseases. That's what is needed now, today, before winter. So, and that will be done by humanitarian agencies. The space is there, we can do it, and the Taliban are allowing that to happen, and that's the priority. The second priority is to resolve the more complicated problem of how will this country be run? Who will pay the salaries of ministries run by the Taliban? If you don't pay the salaries in the health sector, hospitals will collapse. The whole health system, already very fragile, will collapse. That will cause a much worse refugee or displacement movement that will be incredibly difficult to manage. So a solution, a compromise solution, will have to be found whereby the Western donors that have frozen most of development funds make some steps in the direction of the Taliban, and the Taliban make some steps in the direction of the demands of the international community, which are extremely important. Education of girls, women allowed to work, and the rights of minorities. I single out these three that seem to me the most urgent. I think this convergence will be complex and painful, but it is possible. If that happens and funds can then be utilized also to make the state function, we'll have averted the worst, and we'll have also laid the ground for an Afghanistan that is not perhaps corresponding to the dreams that we've had for 20 years of modernizing the country in a certain way, but that will at least preserve the country as stable and respectful of the fundamental rights of its people.
Thank you for that. Regarding resettlement of Afghans, I mean, you and I know that for years, Afghans have been one of the leading groups of refugees coming into the UN system. How do you see any changes in countries that you're working with on actually receiving Afghans? I mean, an estimated, 40 to 50,000 who have come out just in the last several months, and are some of them languishing at American military bases, some of them in other places, some of them trying to make their way in Pakistan and nearby countries. Do you see any changes in how they may be resettled, those who have gotten out?
Now, I would like to make a distinction here. Those that have been evacuated by the United States, by NGOs, that's a very particular, specific problem. They're actually scattered all over the world. That operation was not done by us. We would have advised perhaps to do it differently, but anyway, it was not done by us. Now, I understand, we're trying to help wherever possible to ensure that people that can have access to the United States have that access, and for others, we will have to find other solutions. But that's a finite problem. That's not going to become much bigger, whether we like it or not. What will continue to be a problem, and you rightly mentioned it, is, first of all, let's not forget, there's millions of Afghan refugees preceding this crisis in Pakistan and Iran in particular. And many of them, even before the 15th of August, but maybe even more so now, are in need of resettlement to third countries where they can be more secure. Partly because they may be more at risk now in the vicinity of Afghanistan, partly because even returning to Afghanistan may have been an option before. It's not an option anymore now. So I hope that in respect of the United States, a country that has recently and laudably, the president has really importantly increased the resettlement quota, the yearly resettlement quota, to 125,000. I hope that the sizable chunk of that new quota can be utilized for Afghan refugees. of those already existing in the vicinity of Afghanistan that deserve resettlement. And I think you're right. There are, even in this situation, not a huge number, but people that have fled, including after the 15th of August, not evacuated. They have fled through their own means. They find themselves mostly in Pakistan and in other countries. And I hope that due consideration will be given to their urgent resettlement, because to answer your question, we see a lot of fatigue on the part of the countries neighboring Afghanistan to allow a lot more people to come. So if this is, God forbid, but if this is going to happen, we need to increase resettlement to show these countries that they're not alone, that there is a kind of responsibility sharing on the part of the US and other countries.
These are major issues and I really appreciate the time you've taken to explain more about them. And they sort of, I think, epitomize how large the crisis is, because we've talked about two crises around the world, and I know that your attention is focused on so many. So as we wrap up, I wonder if you would take a few minutes to highlight some of the other areas in the world that may not be on all of our radars, and that should be places where there are acute refugee crises ongoing, or where you estimate we will be seeing and talking a lot more about the plight of displaced people.
I would certainly start by singling out the plight of almost 1 million refugees from Myanmar, from Burma, belonging to the Muslim minority, the Rohingya refugees. They are mostly in Bangladesh. The coup d'etat that happened in Myanmar, in Burma, on the 1st of February made the already remote possibility of returning home to a safe area where their rights would be respected even more complicated. And I am very worried that, at one point, you remember there was a lot of interest, and now interest in this population is waning, and I'm worried about that. Yeah. I am worried about the situation in West Africa, in the Sahel, where, a combination of climate change, conflict, rising terrorism, and chronic underdevelopment has generated a massive displacement crisis inside and across the countries of West Africa. At the other end of the continent, you have a war in Ethiopia that is escalating, with neither the federal government of Ethiopia nor the Tigray authorities finding a way to peaceful negotiations, but escalating the military response, which can only lead to more displacement and suffering of people. And finally, I would say, you have the crisis in Syria. The situation has evolved, but the conflict is still unresolved 11 years after it started. This has produced the displacement of, at one point, almost half of the Syrian population. 5.5 million refugees are still in the neighboring countries. I'm just back from Lebanon and Syria itself. In Lebanon, 1 person in 4 is a refugee, a country that in itself is going through a devastating political and social and economic crisis. So, as political solutions are painfully pursued without much result in all these places, we have to think of humanitarian responses for all this displaced population, but we also have to think more creatively about solutions for all of them, so that we also give them a light at the end of the tunnel.
A light at the end of the tunnel is a very good way to end. Thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much for having me.